Well, here we go. It's Friday morning here in Cannes. I guess that's a day for reflection. A few people taking a long, hard look at themselves. I'm sure. I'm here with Dan Hagen, CSO for iProspect. Thanks for joining us, Dan, and Sean Healy, the same from Carat, CSO for Carat globally. And we're just going to sort of look back on the week and take a look at some of the things that sort of felt interesting to us. I'm just going to ask you to maybe think back to a word or a phrase or a moment through the week that really felt a bit more significant for you, I guess. I'll start with my own. There was a great line from one of the data scientists at Google who sort of popped the balloon, I think, a little bit around data science. It said 99% of what we do is boring, obvious, or useless. So I guess your challenge this morning is to sort of outperform Google's data. If you can get into the 1%, I think we're doing all right.
Dan will immediately exceed that, I imagine.
Yeah,
I'll do my very best.
So maybe we'll start with you, Dan. What was a moment of the week for you that really felt like it meant something?
Sure. So I guess there's a couple of moments that sort of come together, and I think that's the idea of balance, or the sort of the concept of and as opposed to or. And I think certainly my experience over the last few years at Cannes, but also at other industry events, is the sort of almost grandstanding of luminaries on one side of the argument that we sort of have in the industry at the moment, which is this idea of creativity versus a very sort of math-driven, data-orientated approach to things. And I think a lot of that was driven by sort of the desire for inflammatory language and column inches. Yeah, so you get a big famous creative who's talking about it's all about individual brilliance and creativity. As some people who will remain nameless, but whose pictures are on this on the Palais here quite frequently. But the thing I thought was actually really lovely was so many talks I went to this year were embracing actually that middle ground. And that's a little bit more boring, you could argue, but actually it produces, I think, really amazing work. So for me, that sort of concept of and, that concept of balance has been something really, I think, optimistic for the future of the industry.
Actually, just to, I agree, Dan. I think there's been much less hyperbole this year, which I guess Cannes tends to be built on hyperbole. But for me, the very first presentation on Monday from Nick Law, who's the Publicis sort of chief creative officer, and the way that he was talking about the need for creatives to reconnect and understand media and context better, for me, sort of set out with that kind of balanced argument, because it wasn't the stereotypical rant for kind of more creativity. It was a really practical observation on the fact that creatives had lost control of what they perceive to be their industry, in part because they don't get the formats, the contexts, the platforms that we're working with. And I thought he said something really smart, which was that media and creative agencies need to reconnect rather than reintegrate in the same building. So that his answer wasn't, and it was a balanced answer, his answer wasn't become full service agencies again. It was, join the craft up, but keep what's kind of great about the cultures you get in both types of agency. Yeah. And I think that sort of set the tone for some more kind of balanced conversations thereafter.
That's an optimistic view, I guess, but then you look at someone like Walk, who was here this week with the effectiveness report, and one thing that really stuck out for me was this, the old canard that creatively awarded work is 6 times more effective than non-creatively awarded work, but that is no longer true. So we had sort of Peterfield making a plea to the Palais to fix this problem. But do you buy into that? Do you buy into his data or into that idea?
Well, I think it's really interesting to analyse kind of creative awards through a kind of business lens, but you have to remember that you're fishing in quite a specific pool, because you're tending to be looking at work done by and entered by advertising agencies. So lots of the work that Bennett and Field do focuses on that pool, rather than what I think we were hearing on the Walk Day on Wednesday, with lots of people saying everything's about total experience. And the own stuff, the CRM, etc., that often doesn't get factored into the awards papers that they're looking at, is sort of super important. So yeah, I mean, I guess, I wasn't fortunate enough. I had to kind of go to a client meeting, so I missed what he was saying in detail. But I think they're only looking at one part of the picture.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think if you look at the nature of the work, so it's very difficult to get a really good appreciation of all the work that's judged and awarded, because just the volume is so vast. But I spent a few hours literally walking the basement of the Palais, looking at the boards, looking at the different elements of work. And I think an area where you can try to get a sense of sort of the type of work, if you like, that's coming through, is looking at some of the integrated awards. Particularly like in the media sector, where, what I would expect to see is highly awarded work is, really fully integrated campaigns going right the way across lots of different channels. And I would also expect them to provide that sort of 6 times kicker in terms of effectiveness. But the density of that just isn't there. It feels like so much of that work is very stunty. It's good, it's brilliant, it's amazing, but you don't get the sense that longevity, that it's going to be around for a long time. And then you also look at some of the outcomes. And I actually had a nice whinge about this a few years ago when I judged, is that so many of those outcomes are impressions, are clicks, are shares, and so few of them take it through to, either improvement in brand preference and performance, or genuine business.
There was an example,
outcomes.
I know the CPR campaign you mentioned earlier in the week was a perfect example of that.
Yeah, it was
not a commercial outcome.
Yeah, it was a lovely piece of work. I thought the idea was brilliant. They basically took a video game in China. The problem was that people don't know how to do CPR, basically, and it was a very sort of Fortnite-esque game. I think it was called Blood River in China, and they changed the game so that if your character died, you could perform CPR, and if you did it correctly, you'd bring your character back to life. So a sort of bonus for the gamer, if you like, inside the game, and it had that sort of teaching people to do CPR. And they taught a bunch of people, but there was no, at least in the write-up of the award, there was no sort of follow-up, because the problem was 1%, and then there was no, is it now 2%, or is it now 3%, or do they change the profile of people who knew CPR? So again, you just want that extra bit that says, this is something that will carry on, this is something that delivered for that client.
Yeah. So are we saying that, in theory or philosophically, it feels like the industry's kind of got to the mindset of needing that balance that you talked about, but actually we're still quite away from sort of solving this long-term versus short-term conundrum.
This isn't a direct answer to the question, but it's just a sort of a bit of a build. Just back to the point on big, famous, kind of creatively awarded kind of campaigns, which obviously are kind of super important, but also like sweating the small stuff is really, really important to drive results. And I was really impressed by a presentation from the BBDO CEO, where he was basically showing lots of examples of work that their agencies had done that cracked the problem of communicating effectively in 6 seconds or less. And some of this stuff was absolutely brilliant. It's really, really smart work for Honda, Mars, loads of other clients. And I'm not sure whether this stuff's ever going to get a massive gong, but it was stuff that was smart and effective, was solving a real kind of creative problem. So it does feel to me like people are starting to figure out the way to use some of the formats and kind of platforms that Nick Law was kind of bemoaning.
And that BBDO work, there was some sort of callbacks to the past there, wasn't there? He was sort of talking about drawing on lessons from outdoor and print.
Yeah, it was creative thinking about creative problems, because they'd gone back to press and posters, and in essence what they were saying is we live in a world where everyone thinks about the cut down for social, but actually what we should be doing is thinking about making a static thing animated, but for 6 seconds. So I mean that was a big takeout for me. Like, don't think cut down, think still forward or animation. So I think all is not lost. There's still smart thinking going on.
There's hope, even on a Friday morning.
Yes, definitely.
Good news. So Sean, that idea of balance, I guess that's a really sort of nice thought to take away. What would you throw into the mix, Sean?
Well, I thought I'm sure that no young adult wants to be known as a Gen Zer or a Gen Zer, but early in the week I was really struck by seeing people in that cohort talking about brands and how they could create content and their sort of the changing notions of identity So I saw a really interesting kind of piece on masculinity redefined. Saw some great stuff presented by Samsung, who'd done a load of research into kind of what motivates that group. So for me, there was a real sense at the beginning of the week that cohort do demand social impact and responsible behaviour by brands and meaning and purpose, much more so than say the millennial cohort, who were supposed to be people who were motivated by kind of business doing good. So I got a real sense that marketing is going to change and is listening to those people, and they're actually going to change marketing for the better.
So we think it's kind of different. There's been no shortage of sort of criticism of looking at millennials as one sort of homogenous group, and debate around how helpful that is. But we feel that maybe with a generation that genuinely have never known anything different than always on access to all information.
Yeah. So
everywhere.
today's 19-year-old was 5 when YouTube launched. So they've kind of grown up with different influences, different notions of creativity. They're more collaborative. They're more kind of given to working in teams. I think that they are, and this is one of the phrases that were being used, that they're seeking to defy conventions, because lots of the conventions that are out there in the world are not particularly helpful to them. So yeah, I got a real sense that smart marketing people are kind of getting this, that there is something, every cohort gets a sort of, some sort of slightly unfortunate moniker, but there is definitely always a truth that cohorts have their own thing, and prevailing attitudes do change generation on generation. And I think we just saw lots of really interesting stuff. Yeah, so whether it's about the creative process or what they want from brands, some really interesting differences for us to work with.
Yeah. Do you buy that, Dan?
Yeah, and I think it's having a really positive effect on marketing in general. I think that desire by that younger generation, not exclusively younger generation, but that desire for brands to do good stuff in the marketplace, and I think brands are responding to that. So we saw, I think everyone knows the great work that came from Nike with the Colin Kaepernick work, and how that extended across lots of different areas. That was awarded well. We've seen the advertising coming out of P&G with Gillette very much changing, the best a man can get and what that means. And I think that's really resonating. And some of the research we've done earlier this year is demonstrating that people are much more willing to either embrace a brand or to boycott a brand based on its sort of social purpose and how it behaves. We actually had, out here on the beach, we had Extinction Rebellion, made an appearance, and with potentially valid concerns that says the industry needs to do more to drive that purpose forward and to
perhaps not dealt with as appropriately as we might have hoped.
It's very
for.
possible. I mean, we know that
last night.
French authorities are efficient, and they were scooped away relatively quickly. But I do think it's a valid concern for agencies and for brands to think about, well, what are we doing, or what could we do beyond selling products that actually mean that we're creating a world where this younger generation feels much more positive growing into it.
Yeah, I love that the Volvo work around I think it was the Eva project, but I think there was something in that was really about how the nature of competition is changing. So this was Volvo basically making all of their data around female crash test dummies. They're the only car maker to have female crash test dummies, and they've made all of that data public, open source to all of their competitors. And that's a brave move, right, from a company that's done that sort of thing before. But it's really, I think there's something very interesting around taking competitive advantage by giving away your commercial secrets.
It was like pure. They understand their purpose. It's very, very purpose-driven marketing. So they're furthering their long-term success by perhaps giving away a short-term competitive advantage, but it's sort of taking the higher ground, which I think is super powerful.
But I mean, for me, that's one of the great things. Actually, one of the great things about Cannes, is that our industry seeks to make itself better overall by sharing stuff that normally you would keep for kind of competitive advantage. And obviously there's an element of people wanting to kind of show off and make a name for themselves. But I think that I always feel a genuine sense that people want everybody to do better work. And so people are the Future of Strategy day that Walk runs on a Wednesday that Dan and I kind of both both are kind of keen attendees of. In essence, people are opening up all of their kind of processes, their future-facing thinking, their kind of best cases, so that fellow craftspeople can kind of learn from them and potentially kind of go one step further than them or beat them in a pitch. But there is an interesting spirit of generosity in the way that a lot of people behave, which is great.
And that session on strategy, what were some of the themes coming out of that? We talked a bit about this chaos point yesterday.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll give you a couple, and then I'm sure Dan can pick up. Well, I think that there's a real feeling that planning for experience, total end-to-end experience is kind of where it's at now. And I think account planning, which often has been a little bit stuck in the, we're trying to write a brief for a 30-second ad. I think like the top account planners now are kind of recognizing that they're trying to write briefs and create work which works across a whole range of kind of channels and solves business problems in different ways. So that was really interesting. I mean, there were some you're always going to get great phrases to nick. So the very brilliant, I think, European head of strategy for McCann came out with this phrase that, if it doesn't move people, it's not going to move business, and that's always been the case. So he was very, very, very good on, sticking with the kind of fundamentals of human-centered fundamentals of planning, and not being distracted by the oversupply of signals that we have to work with. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, he also talked about not outsourcing common sense, which was sort of, I guess, leads you into another little bit of a theme, which was around people and really deeply understanding people. Yes, from the mounds and huge piles of behavioral data that we have, which again I thought was a nice, right the way through this. There was a real drive for more creativity, more understanding people, but not at the expense of everything you can also learn from behavioral data. So it was, that and point I think came out again. But this real drive, and the guys, was it Martin and who's the other chap? And Rob, and Rob from RGA, who talks about the chaos, and part of the work strategy day. And it was brilliant. I mean, it was a super inspiring speech anyway. You got two guys who are, they were great. They were riffing off each other. They had a really good vibe going. Just like us, yeah, it's brilliant. They also had an audience full of planners who were, cheering at their points and stuff. So it was just an inspiring session. But Rob was really, really pushing on that point about understanding people, but not at the expense of understanding them through the 1% of Google. That's brilliant, but deeply understanding who those people are. And he just had this great turn of phrase for sort of finding that nugget of insight that can really drive amazing work, which is sort of what's the dirty little secret? What's that thing that either they do every day that's just a little bit interesting or a little bit different? And you only get that by understanding them as genuine people, not as consumers, not as shoppers, not as whatever it is that we put them in as a bucket, but actually human beings. And I think if you're going to change and how people feel, you have to understand them as human beings.
Well, I think you're dead right and they're dead right. And what I thought was really interesting was they were saying, stop just looking at data, go and actually talk to people. Go and hang out in their living rooms. The more you can imbibe of the kind of cultural context in which they live, the better the work's going to be. And I think it's very, very refreshing to have people who are like at the top of their game saying you need to go and do that. And I think those are things that people used to do more often. I know that I think we used to do it more often, and I think it's very important for us going forward that we make sure that people get from behind their desks and go and put themselves in context, walk a mile in people's shoes, hang out with them, and that will make all of the kind of great stuff that we can do.
Find the cultural edge. That was
exactly. Well, no, I mean, actually, if we really want to kind of geek out, they would, which
some of us do,
which I obviously do most of the time. But they were talking about learning from the natural world. Learning from the natural world, and that actually the most interesting, evolutionary occurrences and biodiversity sort of flourishes in these places where two different terrains meet each other. So they were saying, look at the places where different kind of cultures are kind of colliding, and that's where kind of future-facing insights will come from. So, one for the geeks.
Yeah.
But very good.
always one for the geeks. Let's stay with the geeks because we talked earlier. We talked earlier in the week around again, I think the phrase, I think it might be another Google phrase. I'm not there. I'm not sponsored, I promise. But it was the nerds have finally figured it out, and I think it was this idea that finally we're seeing past the technology. We're seeing sort of past the means and actually looking at the ends in terms of how that's used.
Yeah, I think there was in a session that Ivy Ross hosted, who's the head of design at Google, and so she's responsible for all the home products and the phones and how those things are actually designed. And she was talking about moving from sort of design thinking to design feeling, I guess. And that was the sort of the payoff. I think I can't remember who the quote was from, but it was like a newspaper quote or something, which was that the nerds have kind of finally figured it out. And again, I thought the thing that was really interesting from what she was talking about is that she's analyzing lots and lots of information, lots of data, but what she's really doing is she's trying to design for a feel. So she's trying to not design so you say that's an interesting, that's a great product in front of me, but how does that product make me feel? And they're doing some really fascinating things using sort of deep data analysis to almost quantify that. And this is the bit that she thought was really cool, is because, as a designer, she said, I can see when something's beautifully designed and brilliantly designed. I can feel how it moves me personally, and I can sort of talk to a few people. But they were doing experiments to almost quantify this. So they created an installation with 3 different rooms that you could experience. You went and you sat in that room for 5 minutes and you experienced that room. At the same time, everyone who went through the experience had a band that took some biometric readings and things like that, and they would give you at the end of it a nice sort of quite beautifully rendered profile of which room made you feel most at peace. Regardless of what your conscious mind was saying, it was trying to read from you about what your body was experiencing. Yeah. And I think it was super powerful. She's then able to take this data and aggregate this stuff together and go back and actually then turn that design for feeling concept into something that can be quantified into sort of harder business metrics, which is a brilliant place to be, because now I've got something that's very creativity driven, but I'm able to quantify it for someone who's very math driven, which again is that sort of bringing that point back.
We saw parallels of that, didn't we, with the Soul Machine work, whether using AI to pick up on body language and signals in voice and in language, actually this technology can sort of understand how you're feeling as you're responding, as opposed to necessarily just what you're saying.
That literally was humanizing the machine in a really interesting way. So that was a really great example from those guys of the geeks figuring it out and solving I think a real human. What was interesting was the problem that they were solving with their super AI-driven virtual assistant was the fact that within the beauty market and skincare in particular, product range and product efficacy has become so complex that many women are feel intimidated in retail environments and don't actually get the right advice as to how to use the product. And this was their kind of clever solution for giving people a human-friendly face for the brand. So it was a P&G brand, SK2. A great application of that kind of deep tech to solve a human problem with a human face.
Yeah,
very smart.
So let's maybe wrap this up. We've talked about this, this idea of balance and things coming together, and I guess the big one for the week is the way that creativity now is being applied across different platforms and different formats, perhaps more successfully than it has done in the past. I certainly got a sort of an impression a lot of the work looks genuinely creative in ways beyond what we've seen before. What would you pull out as firstly, do you agree, and secondly, would you pull out any examples of that?
I think so. I think that there's always a lag between someone on the stage going, there's this amazing new technology, that's what the future is, and then people figuring out what how to use it. I mean, I'd kind of go back to a couple of examples that I've cited that was the human face of the skincare brand. Loads of the stuff, really kind of brilliant, cute stuff that was kind of working in under 6 seconds. I got a feeling in the various seminars that I went into that people were starting to figure this out, but they were figuring it out because of the thought process they were applying to the use of the technology and seeing it as a means to solve a human problem rather than an end in itself. And I think when people stop seeing things as ends and see them as means, then you get great work out of them.
Yeah. Dan, just before you answer, so we saw also kind of the downside, I guess, of that argument that is getting better. I don't know if you saw the research that the FT published, but looking at the degree to which people feel confident in building their brands, there was a really striking slide in that deck around the fact that social media and online display are rated the highest channels for brand building effectiveness. By that cohort, traditional TV now in 7th place on that list. It still feels like we've got a way to go in terms of understanding how brands really are built in a new economy context.
Yeah, and I think there's also, you're looking at a survey of people versus the sort of empirical data of effectiveness. And there was a study, I don't know, 6 to 12 months ago that did a similar thing. A survey went out to lots of people in the industry, and then they actually compared the results of that survey with the I think it was probably work data of actual effectiveness of those various channels at driving various different outcomes. And they found there was quite a disparity between what marketers and agency people considered to be effective channels and what actually were empirically measured as effective channels. Yeah.
The radio came out brilliantly.
And it's just fascinating. And there is a thing, we're super excited by the shiny, the new, and you obviously see a ton of that at Cannes, and I think we just need to be cognizant that just because it's new and cool and interesting doesn't necessarily mean it's the most effective. But that said, we should also be working on how do we make it more effective. So, what Sean was talking about earlier around the 6 seconds, I would argue one of the reasons that in empirical data, social display and those types of channels are sometimes a little bit weaker in terms of their ability to drive brand outcomes, to drive business outcomes, is because we're creatively approaching it the wrong way. If you're not designing from the ground up for 6 seconds and you're doing the cut down, as Sean says, you're not going to be as effective. Our own studies from D2D tell us that the second most powerful driver of ROI after brand size is the quality of the creative. Well, if we're just taking some 6-second cut down of a 30-second ad, slapping it onto a digital channel, we're basically taking that second one and we're throwing it away, which is completely bonkers.
We should give a shout out here to the attention economy team at Dan. They're doing a lot of work around trying to better understand.
If anyone needs to read about that, I believe that Clive Record has 3,000 printed copies of the attention economy
not anymore.
That he's been carrying around in his bag for this
closet,
week, and he has distributed those incredibly efficiently. A one-man distribution mechanism was very spectacular.
The oldest channel in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think on that shameless old school plug, we will wrap things up. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.